we go along. We're also, in this session, we'll be doing some polling, so we'll have some questions to ask you. Now, if our technology is working okay, then that will come up on your screen and you'll be asked to vote. I think I would probably place myself somewhere on in terms of technological proficiency, so somewhere on the spectrum between Dave Ward and Chris Webb. So by the end of the session, we'll have worked out exactly where on that spectrum I sit. And also, just to give you a quick overview of the timings for this session. So I'll hand over to Dave in a minute. He's going to give a bit of an overview. I'm then going to do a presentation and talk through some of the issues in the world of work. We've then got 3 guest speakers who will tell us about some of the issues that they've been campaigning on. We've been working with them on to push for a new deal for workers, and we'll be asking you which of those you like best. Then Dave is going to give an overview of the next steps for the campaign before we've got Gordon Brown, and we'll have a video from Gordon, and then we'll have a Q&A with everybody, and that will hopefully take us up to 2:30. If you see us all looking panicked and the music for Bon Jovi coming on as well, it's because we've got dead air that Chris has decided to fill, or it could be because someone's just gone on for too long. So we'll see what happens. But without further ado, I will hand over to Dave to give a bit of an overview about the New Deal for Workers campaign and why this session is important.
Okay, thanks everybody for rejoining us. Yeah, so one of the things that we've tried to do within the CWU in recent years is connect our industrial and political agendas. So my observation would be that the union, when it talks about politics, needs to root that in the reality of our members' working lives, first and foremost. Obviously, there are other political issues that we need to deal with. So we've been doing a lot of work within our own union about the type of policies that will actually help our own members, but more importantly, in some ways, will shift the balance of forces in the whole world of work. And obviously, there are some specific policies that we've pushed and that you'll be aware of. So Postbank, we've done a lot of work in the last few years on how we could turn the post office into a post bank that would help society build an infrastructure where people could and businesses could lend money on the high street in a different way, in a more ethical way, and where we could end financial exclusion. And there was some great work done and documents published, supported by the Labour Party, on how we would develop that post bank. Similarly, we brought forward proposals working with Labour around rolling out universal free broadband. And what I'd say about that is obviously that was designed to support the members in our TNFS constituency, not just in BT, but in all the companies that we represent members, because we were talking about raising employment standards in the sector. And I suppose one of the interesting things is that was an idea that was criticised about a year ago, or just around the time of the general election. But it's interesting to see how many people are now talking about that being at the root of ending poverty, of changing society, making it more equal, and giving people an opportunity to adjust to the way that they're working during this pandemic. So I'd like to think that we were ahead of the curve on that one, and we should continue to push that. Similarly, within Royal Mail, we've talked about renationalisation, but we've talked more recently about the opportunities that exist for a company like Royal Mail to use its unrivaled network, its infrastructure, and most importantly, use postal workers to be a link to society and see them as more than just delivering parcels, but actually get out there delivering prescriptions, delivering products and services that are going to help businesses grow in the economy. And, we've been talking to the company. That's one of the issues at the heart of our dispute, and there'll be more about that. So, wherever we've looked at our political work, we've rooted it in the New Deal. With the New Deal for workers, the reason why, I see this as the number one political issue for the union to talk about the world of work and changing it is because of what we've seen over decades. And it's important that as we deal with COVID, that we recognise that the problems we're facing in the world of work haven't just come as a result of COVID. They've been made worse by COVID, and we do face the prospect of mass unemployment, and that's why Gordon Brown is going to use this session to call for a national jobs summit and to make it clear that what the government have put on offer is not good enough. But we know that that problem in the world of work has been decades in the making. So we set out our New Deal campaign, and we set it out on the basis of trying to galvanise the whole of the trade union movement behind that campaign. If you recall, it was our union that called for the TUC to hold the New Deal for Workers demo about 3 years ago. We had a fantastic turnout, and the union has continued to pressurise the TUC and to work with other trade unions in taking this campaign forward. Interestingly enough, we've seen Boris Johnson recently use the New Deal logo for himself, but what we're talking about is a real New Deal. We put those 4 points forward originally. One was about the need for common bargaining agendas. So this is a point that I'm really keen on, where we don't have to wait for legislation to change in this country. Trade unions can make change happen. And one of the ways we do that is by working with other trade unions in sectors of the economy and coming up with employment standards for each of those sectors and agreeing a common bargaining agenda. And you're going to hear about that. We talked about the need for unions to cooperate in a completely different way to organise more workers, particularly in the private sector. And, we're pleased that the pledge that was recently agreed by all trade union leaders at the recent TUC Congress, online Congress, is the start of that process. We talked about a manifesto for workers, and when we come back, I want to go through some of the issues that should be in that manifesto. And trade unions would then need to communicate that effectively to all of their members. And we talked about action to mobilise workers, and I'll talk about that again. Because for me, the real challenge is this, is we need to win for working people. We're going to have to mobilise working people behind a very distinct trade union agenda. So look, I've set out the basis of the session. What Andrew's now going to do is invite some people who we've worked with, developing certain policies that will be in the New Deal campaign. Over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. So it's actually worse than that. I'm going to run through a presentation. Yeah, so sorry everybody, but you've got to hear from me for a little bit. So what I'm going to do is share my screen, and hopefully you'll all be able to see the presentation. Dave, can I get a thumbs up?
It's good, mate. All good.
Great. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the world of work today. There will be quite a few stats and numbers here, so I'll try to make sure that it's not death by PowerPoint. The other kind of public health warning is that there isn't a lot of good news here. So if you're depressed by lockdown, then I apologise. But as Dave said, we're going to try to balance this out with our positive agenda on the world of work and talking about what we're going to do. So if I can share, yeah. So what do we mean by a New Deal for workers? What I've put up here is really, so our kind of key narrative and then 4 key points about what we mean. So firstly, look, our key narrative is that we think the current economic model that we've got, current employment model that we've got in this country is broken. And therefore we need a New Deal for workers, a new settlement for people in work, which is based on kind of 4 broad things. So firstly, a new set of employment rights that will end insecurity. And I'll talk about some of the forms of insecurity in a minute. Secondly, that we need to shift the balance of power in decision-making to workers and also shift where reward is going to. Thirdly, there should be a recognition that we need good work and not just jobs for their own sake. And then finally, in terms of a New Deal, this is obviously pertinent. The phrase comes from FDR, so it's about a response to the crisis that we're seeing with coronavirus and the economy now, with security and good unionised jobs at its heart. So I've kicked off by saying that we think the world of work and the employment model is broken, but I want to start off, and we're going to test the poll now by asking, who is it that thinks we've seen a jobs miracle? So hopefully Chris can share the poll on the screen with everybody now to vote. We'll see if the tech is working.
I can, mate. All of our questions are in one block, these three. So I don't know if you wanted to phrase all the questions and then I'll put all the poll up, if that makes sense.
Okay, maybe we'll do this at the end then. So yeah. What we'll ask at the end is which of these four people think that we've seen a jobs miracle? So is it Rishi Sunak, Sajid Javid, Philip Hammond, George Osborne? So one thing that they've got in common is they all like having stupid photos taken. And if you're going to have a stupid photo taken, it's going to be shared on a trade union presentation. The other thing, obviously, is that they're Tory, the past four Tory chancellors. So we will come back to that question. Which of those thinks we've seen a jobs miracle and would disagree with our analysis? Now, if you're depressed about seeing a load of Tories photographed on your screen, then you might be even more depressed by the amount of text on this next slide. But what I want to do is talk about how low pay has become a cornerstone of the economy. So when we're talking about insecurity. So I think for us, one of the best ways to think about insecurity in the world of work and some of the problems we're seeing is what's gone on with pay. And for me, the easiest way to understand that is by looking at a living wage. So the real living wage. So the real living wage is put together by the Living Wage Foundation. It's based on their survey of what people think everybody should be able to have access to, how much money you need to earn in order to afford that. So it's things like a broadband connection, a mobile phone, a TV license, those sorts of things. Now, the Living Wage Foundation sets that at about 18,000 across the country or 21,000 in London. So we're not talking massive amounts, and this is, thousands of pounds less than an OPG or, an engineer is going to be earning, whether that's in Royal Mail or BT. So my estimate is that you've got over 8 million workers who are earning less than a real living wage. And that's about a quarter of the entire workforce. So a quarter of the entire workforce not earning enough to get by and have a decent standard of living. Now that, I think I want to stress just how prevalent that is. 1 in 4 workers not earning enough to have a decent standard of living. And within that 8 million, we also see some people at the extreme. So about 1.8 million people who are classed as self-employed and aren't entitled to the legal minimum wage actually and less than that legal minimum threshold, so of about £17,000 a year. And a further 1.8 million people are right on that threshold. So, some people might think that I've set the threshold too high with the real living wage, but we do see a significant amount of in-work poverty as a result of this. Now, the other point that I want to make is not just that this is really common, so 1 in 4, but that we've seen this getting worse over the past decade. So if we look at just employees, then that's gone up by close to 50%. So from 15% of employees earning less than a real living wage to 21%. Now, what that means in real terms is that, even before the crisis and coronavirus struck, we had record levels of in-work poverty. So over half of families that live in poverty are actually have a working parent. We've got record levels of personal debt as people borrow to make ends meet. And 1 in 4 people, and this was before the crisis, were saying that they didn't have enough savings to last a month if they lost their income. So that tells you, 1, that things are that low pay is extremely prevalent. 2, that it's been rising over the past decade. And 3, we do have people who are in really dire straits without enough savings to last themselves a month. And that is causing, obviously, some real difficulties around coronavirus. So the next slide. We've also, alongside low pay, the other kind of cornerstones of an insecure employment model are insecure employment practices. And there are 3 that I want to highlight here. So the first is 0 hours contracts. So about a decade ago, these had hardly been heard of. So there are about 100,000 people working on 0 hours contracts. Today, that is now a record level. So it's over 1 million people. That's over 3% of the workforce and up by more than 900,000 since the financial crash. And what that means is that these people don't have security over their hours from week to week. They don't have security over their income week to week. But we know that on average, 0 hours contract workers are working about 20 hours every week. So employers could be giving them a more regular working practice and could be guaranteeing a minimum number for them each week. Now, interestingly enough, we also see a lot of insecurity and a lot of exploitation going around with 0 hours contracts. So for instance, if you're a woman on a 0 hours contract and you become pregnant, ACAS, so an independent body, has said that what tends to happen is you will start seeing work drying up. If you're off sick, you will start seeing work drying up. And this obviously causes huge problems. And we also see a range of other forms of exploitation. So whether people get paid for travel time or other things around the uncertainty over their hours. So 0 hours contracts are a huge issue now. Alongside that, then we've got self-employment. So people in self-employment don't get the standard rights that employees are entitled to. So if you're self-employed or classed as self-employed, then you don't get the legal right to the minimum wage, you don't get the legal right to sick pay, you don't get a legal right to a pension, you don't get a legal right to annual leave. So there are lots of things that many employees take for granted and that unions have fought for that people who are self-employed don't get. Now that again is at a record level, 5 million people at the start of 2020. So that's gone up by 1.2 million since the financial crash. And what we've seen is 15% of the workforce are actually now self-employed. Now, some of those will be people who genuinely run their own business, but there are estimates that bogus self-employment, so people who actually, to all intents and purposes, are working just like somebody in Royal Mail, just like somebody in BT, but are just being denied their rights by a legal classification. So the estimate of that number of people varies between about 500,000 and up to 3.7 million. So, you know, we're really talking about a large group of people who don't have the basics here. And that's a massive problem, self-employment as well. And then alongside that, of course, we've got agency, casual and seasonal work, which were the more common forms of insecure employment about 15 years ago. Now that again has gone up since the crash. That's about 800,000 people. That's still gone up about 7% alongside these new forms of insecurity that we're seeing. So what I'd say is so much for the jobs miracle. And we obviously had the poll at the start, and we can come back to that at the end. So that one of the Tory chancellors has been telling us about. So over this past decade, what we've seen is while job numbers have risen to record levels, at the same time, low pay is up by over 50% and now covers 1 in 4 workers. Over 10% of people are in insecure models, and it could be far higher. So that's self-employment, 0 hours contracts, agency or other casual forms of work. And when we hear about a growth in employment having taken place over the past decade by about 4 million people, actually what we've seen is that 2/3 of that growth has been in insecure employment. So this is really a huge problem. You know, we're seeing in the world of work things getting more precarious, less secure, and low pay becoming far more prevalent. The other thing that I want to highlight here is that the UK has now, over the past decade, seen the longest squeeze on wages for over 200 years. So this impacts on everybody. And the result of that is that for the first time since the 1880s, younger generations can be expected to be made worse off than their parents. So that's the legacy of the financial crash and the jobs miracle that we're being told we've seen. So I want to think briefly about how that relates to the post and telecoms industries. So in post, obviously with Royal Mail, we've seen a huge explosion of employment around Royal Mail. And while Royal Mail, so since it was privatised, has lost around 10,000 jobs, what we've seen is a growth elsewhere. So the industry as a whole isn't in decline. So companies like Amazon, DPD, Hermes, Yodel, they've been growing significantly. Now, this year alone, they've added 30,000 workers and about 20,000 seasonal workers, so creating new jobs as we've seen parcels go up. And my estimate is that we've got around 50,000 couriers in the postal industry who are self-employed, so earning often less than a minimum wage. In some cases, they might be earning as little as £2 an hour, denied those basic rights that I referred to earlier. And again, we've got a similar story in the telecoms industry. So while BT is in a different position to Royal Mail, it was open up to competition far earlier. We haven't seen that level of churn with jobs. And we are seeing BT now recruiting as it is looking to build its fibre network, particularly in Openreach. What we've got is competitors around BT. So the altnets, the small players, starting to recruit more and more. So an example of that would be City Fibre. So this year has recruited 10,000, or has announced that it's recruiting 10,000 new workers. And the use of agency, subcontracting, and again, self-employment is pretty prevalent here. So what we see when we do comparisons is that workers in these companies, so engineers, will be earning up to £10,000 less than they would in Openreach. And this obviously filters through to the things we see. So the pressure that regulators put on these companies, the way that both BT and Royal Mail treat our our members, in a range of ways, the behaviour that we see from them over a number of years. But of course, a New Deal for workers, as we'll go on to talk about, isn't just about insecurity. We want to have a positive agenda. And this is something that our three speakers will talk about slightly later on. But again, that relates back to what we see in our industries. So it's about trade union rights. And we know that these need to be stronger from our own experience. So whether that's the Royal Mail injunction that we saw being taken out that stopped us from taking strike action, whether that's the work that branches are needing to put in to make sure we've dotted all of the I's and crossed every single T in the Count Me In campaign. We saw it with Virgin union busting and getting the CWU de-recognised. So trade union rights is extremely important and is part of the positive agenda we should put forward, not just one about insecurity. Equally, it's about decision-making in businesses. So we know that significant amounts have been paid out by both Royal Mail and BT in dividends. We've seen huge amounts of executive pay. So the most striking example, obviously, being the golden hello that Rico Back got when he came into Royal Mail. But it's also about being able to influence the strategies, two things that we're obviously looking to do with Royal Mail and BT at the moment. And it's about the quality of work more broadly. So issues such as working time, again, issues that we've got in Royal Mail and BT. So Royal Mail with our push for the shorter working week, or in Openreach with the Our Hours campaign. It's about the future, automation, workload and surveillance. And it's also about ending inequality in our workplaces. So the fact that if you're BAME, if you're female, if you're disabled, you're far more likely to be in insecure employment or low pay. So these are all things that we need to take account of with our New Deal for workers. And I'm also just going to say quickly in 3 charts why a New Deal for workers needs to be ambitious. So the first one is this, and I won't kind of spend too long on these, but firstly, we've seen a breakdown in economic growth, which is the green line on the graph, and average weekly earnings. So for the first time on record, we're seeing the economy growing, but actually pay isn't rising with it. And that suggests there's something quite fundamental that's going wrong with our economic model and our employment model. The second one is this. So if you look on the bottom of this graph, what you see is the years. And if you go to 1980 and then trace up to the red line, you see roughly where trade union membership peaked at about 13 million. And from that point, since we've seen continual attacks on the labour movement and industry, we've seen trade union membership declining. But the dotted blue line, which is inequality, rising. So again, we need that positive right on a positive agenda on trade union rights. And then finally, when we look at working hours, the other thing that we've seen is a breakdown in productivity growth and the growth in the economy and the hours that people are getting back as a result of that. So if we'd stayed on the trend that we saw pre-1980, then by 2016, the average full-time working week would have been 33 hours. Today, it's now about 42 hours. So you see that we've gone up way higher than we should have done on trend. So these 3 issues, so looking at decision-making in companies, looking at hours, looking at the share of the economy, looking at trade union rights, are things that our guest speakers are going to pick up in a second. And now I think is probably a good time, Chris, for us to bring them in and I'll introduce them.
Yeah, no problem, mate. Do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Yep.
Yeah, so they're all there ready for you, mate. No problem. You go for it.
Okay, great. So the first person I'm going to introduce is Carolyn Jones. So Carolyn Jones, or CAD, is the director of the Institute of Employment Rights. And what our 3 speakers are going to do is they're going to run through for us 3 ideas that they've been working on that they think we should include as a New Deal for workers. So CAD is going to talk a little bit about sectoral collective bargaining, which you might have heard us using, to explain what that means and how it ties into a New Deal for workers. And I should also say CAD is from the Institute of Employment Rights, which we work very closely with this. They've really set out the core thinking on this. So CAD, I will just unmute you, or Chris, if you could unmute CAD, and we'll bring her in now.
I've unmuted myself.
Even better.
Woohoo! See, I might not have any fancy slides like yours, Andrew, but at least I know how to unmute myself now. Thank you for inviting me. I'm here to pitch an idea that is central to the work of the Institute of Employment Rights. Put simply, We want every worker in the UK to have their terms and conditions of employment negotiated by a trade union. Easy. And I want to give just 5 reasons why I think sectoral collective bargaining would help you as workers, help strengthen the economy, and help reduce inequality in society. But before I give you my 5 reasons, let me just quickly outline what I mean by sectoral collective bargaining. Collective bargaining, as you all know, is when a trade union negotiates the pay and conditions of employment with an employer for its workers. Sectoral collective bargaining is when trade unions and employers negotiate pay and conditions for all those working in their particular sector. So in this instance, in postal and telecommunications. So the CWU and any other unions operating in your sector would sit down with all the companies in your sector and negotiate terms and conditions, and that agreement would cover all workers in your sector and no employer would be allowed to undercut. At the moment, the number of people covered by a collective agreement is depressingly low, as Andrew's just pointed out. It's declined from over 80% in 1979 to less than 20% now. That means, if you think about it, that 8 out of 10 workers in the UK have their terms and conditions of employment imposed on them by their employer, leading, as Andrew just said, to the biggest pay squeeze that we've seen in decades. Of course, you might be the lucky ones. You might still be enjoying the fruits of trade unionism and collective bargaining. But what about your kids? What about your partners? What about your family, your neighbours? How many of them have a say in how their working lives are governed? And even if you are covered now, how many others working in privatised parts of your sector benefit from union coverage? What about workers in Whistle, in Yodel, in DPD, in Amazon? Don't get me started on Amazon. How many of them are on 0-hour contracts and minimum wage, or classified as self-employed by the employer and denied their rights? And that's just the postal side. I'm sure BT's competitors rely on poor conditions to gain their commercial advantages too. And ask yourself this: what impact are those unorganised workplaces having on your future jobs? The race to the bottom is corrosive and undermines all conditions across the sector. So how can sectoral collective bargaining help? I said I have 5 ways. First, sectoral collective bargaining puts more money in workers' pockets. How? Well, unions bring a wage premium to the table. Latest figures from the government show that when unions negotiate pay, workers receive at least 8% more than when wages are imposed unilaterally by the boss. That's just a statistical fact. It's no coincidence, therefore, that as collective bargaining has declined, wages have dropped and inequality has increased, like the chart that Andrew just showed. The problem is the share of national income going into the pockets of workers has been relentlessly declining for 40 years, while company profits and dividends to shareholders are increasing. Second, by raising wages, sectoral collective bargaining gives a massive boost to the economy. With more money in their pockets, workers go out and buy products and services. Think leisure and hospitality. That demand for more products and services provides work for other workers, who in turn then go out and buy products and services from other workers. It creates a cycle of growth in the economy. And what's more, as people earn more, the social security bill goes down and the tax take to the exchequer goes up, helping to fund those public services we all rely on. It's a win-win situation. Third, by setting a level playing field across the sector on pay and conditions, sectoral collective bargaining helps boost productivity. At the moment, the UK has one of the worst productivity levels across the EU. Why? Because instead of competing by investing in research and development, training and new technology, too many employers are surviving by undercutting labour costs like pay, holidays and rights. The bad employers are undermining the good employers and reducing our productivity. By setting employment standards across the whole sector below which no worker can fall, Sectoral collective bargaining will help remove that negative competitive edge and help white out insecurity, inequality, and bad employment practices. Instead, employers would be encouraged to invest in our future, rolling out the fourth industrial revolution in partnership with unions. Fourth, sectoral collective bargaining gives workers a voice at work and helps to democratise the workplace. At the moment, too many people are hired and fired at the whim of the employer. We don't believe that democracy should stop at the door of the workplace. And giving workers a voice at the negotiating table means all the issues you feel are important will be negotiated and not imposed. Issues including decisions on overtime, hours of work and job sharing, levels of training, numbers of apprenticeships, proportion of agency workers in the workforce, the elimination of gender, ethnic and disability pay gaps, data handling, surveillance, green measures, new technology. All these issues should be part of a sectoral collective bargaining agreement. That's how it's done in some of the most successful economies in Europe. That's how we believe it should be done in the UK. Having a strong voice across your sector helps to redress the imbalance of power in the employment relationship mentioned earlier. It also helps to grow the union. If workers can see that their collective voice wins results, they have a reason to join and an ability to have their voices heard. Fifth and finally, sectoral collective bargaining would bring UK employers in line with international law and best practice. Collective bargaining is classed as a fundamental human right. ILO Convention 98 places a duty on our government to encourage and promote collective bargaining machinery. In 2019, just last year, the ILO's Future of Work Commission recommended that the New World Order should be agreed through a collective bargaining process, rather than pitching citizens into a dog-eat-dog race for survival in these trying times. To conclude, if this pandemic has taught us anything, it is the worth of trade unions and the role they can and should play in building a strong, productive economy. We need to ensure that the future world of work is built around the needs of labour, not the needs of capital. We've learned the lessons from the 2008 crash. We've lived through the sacrifices made during this pandemic. People are rightly angry and expecting better. And better is what they and you deserve. Sectoral collective bargaining puts the power to build a better world in the hands of those who keep the economy and our services running, the workers and their unions. So that's my pitch. I hope I win your vote.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Cad. So that was Cad from the IER making the case for sectoral collective bargaining as the policy that we should be pushing for a new deal for workers. And our next speaker, in what I'm going to term the opposite of Dragon's Den, because this is all about not being ripped off by someone who's got a wad of cash to wave at us, is Will Strong. So Will is the director of Will is the director of Autonomy, which is a new think tank that was set up over the past couple of years. They've been pushing heavily on a shorter working week, and Will is going to make a pitch for that as a key policy we should be pushing as part of the New Deal for Workers. So Will, if you unmute yourself, you should be able to come straight in.
Great, thanks Andrew, and thanks for having me. It's great to be amongst Cad and Miriam and kind of pushing policies which I think we all should be advocating in every sector. So I think it's particularly relevant that I'm here talking in a CWU context. The Royal Mail's campaign for shorter working hours is a really pioneering campaign which is getting international attention, and something that we at Autonomy often point to as an example of a trade union really pushing for change and a really forward-thinking policy. And obviously the Hours campaign from the BT, recognizing that time is not just about time on the job, but also travel time as well. And so working time is something which is incredibly important to Autonomy. We've been advocating the shorter working week for a few years now and putting in the research and policy work to try and make that happen, whether that's a sectoral level or a national policy level too. I think it's important to recognise here that historically it's been trade unions who've been winning working time reductions in the UK and globally. So it was the Australian stonemasons in the mid-1800s who won the 8-hour day for the first time. It was American unions who won the weekend at the start of the 20th century. And in the UK, it's been trade unions who, after World War I and World War II, saw huge reductions in working time achieved and maintained. So these periods, the interwar years, were particularly active periods of trade unions to maintain the gains in working time reduction. We lost about 8 hours of the working day with the same pay maintained. And those are victories we should celebrate. These are histories of the trade union movement, which are incredibly important and which I think are now coming to surface once again. I think the CWU's campaign for shorter working hours is the crest of this kind of new interest in working time, particularly as the fourth industrial revolution comes in. So I think that's really important to recognize that the major gains in working time reduction, they're not gifted down by employers, they're not gifted down by government, they come through working class pressure, through the labor movement's pressure, and those agreements. I think sectoral collective bargaining is going to be incredibly important for that as well. Now, I think I want to make a few points about why I think shorter working week should be on the agenda and should be the policy that gets pushed by trade unions and trade unions like the CWU. So we have an overworked economy. That's in the paradox of there being lots of unemployment. We have a hugely overworked economy for those in work. 54% of all work-related sick absences are due to work-related stress, anxiety, and depression. That's from the Health and Safety Executive itself. The key ingredient to that is workload pressure. That's the single largest that's the most opted for reason why work-related stress, anxiety, and depression is a reason for sick days. It's workload pressure itself. So shorter working hours speak to a mental health crisis and an overwork crisis as well. This is not really talked about as much, particularly in a crisis of unemployment, but overwork is a serious problem for workers' health. That's not good for business either. We shouldn't forget that sick days and presenteeism are not good for business performance either. So it's in employers' interest to also give workers time off for recuperation and recovery. As Andrew mentioned in his brilliant opening presentation, productivity growth is no longer linked to prosperity for workers. So wages have been decoupled from growth and from productivity, but also working time reduction. The greatest reduction in working time, as I mentioned, in the first half of the 20th century, when productivity was directly linked to these kind of initiatives. That's stopped since the 1980s, as we saw in that graph from Andrew. That's no longer the case. So we need to be pushing for that, not only just tying it to productivity growth and the economy growing, but also redistributing resources we already have. And so that's something which I think is as Andrew said, it shows an economy is not working for workers, not working for ordinary people. It's certainly working for shareholders, CEOs, and so on. So something's rotten in the heart of Denmark there. And I think what we need to start doing is tying any productivity gains to working time reduction, showing how an economy can work for workers and employers, but also redistributing what we have. We shouldn't just say, okay, we can only have a working time reduction when there is growth. Actually, there's a lot of wealth and income in this economy, and it's about redistributing that. So this is one way of doing it. Fourthly, I think the question of automation. Now, I know in the communications industry, shorter working out automation's a real problem. You know, having consulted with the CWU around the issues that the industry face, automation, particularly in Royal Mail and other similar companies, is a huge issue. Many jobs have been lost. Many jobs have been sped up. When we think about technology in the workplace, we're not just talking about replacing workers, but also surveillance, speeding up of work processes. The intensification of work should be coupled with a shorter working week. What's the response that we have when employers speed up work or replace workers? So the shorter working week should be front and center in that battle. Really kind of hammering home, saying, okay, you want to speed up work, we want more time for ourselves. If work's going to be harder for us, we need to have some kind of something in exchange for that. So automation won't affect all industries the same. Some industries will be affected to a larger degree. But in those where we see new technology come into the workplace, it was front and center in trade union demands. And I'm really happy to see that front and center in the CWU's work. But it really needs to be there so that when we go into this so-called fourth industrial revolution, we have a demand in place. It's not just higher wages, it's also more time for ourselves. I think the COVID period has really shown the relevance of working time. So, you know, we have on the one hand, more people working from home, and studies have already shown that people working from home, the work-life kind of divide bleeds. So more people are working for like an hour or two longer each day. It's hard to turn off when you just have a computer right in front of you. You don't leave your work at the workplace anymore. Your workplace is in your home. So working time is back on the agenda, something which really needs to be regulated and reformed. But then also we have a huge amount of unemployment, kind of risen over this year, but also set to continue when the furlough scheme ends. The government's job support scheme is simply not good enough. Even though it looks like something where you might get paid for reduced hours, it's simply not an incentive for employers, and a lot of workers can't afford the pay cut. So in a time of unemployment, a tried and tested strategy is a shorter working week where you share work around at the same pay, whether it's government subsidized or whether it's forcing employers who have made a lot of money and have already seen the productivity gains of the last few decades, share that around in order to save those industries, save those workers' livelihoods. So the COVID period has made this particularly relevant. And I think I'll end on this, that ultimately, time is life, time is freedom, the freedom to do what we will, whether it's be with our families, with our friends, to develop ourselves, our skills. After all, we work to live, and we shouldn't be living to work. That's something which I think is one of the strongest demands that workers can demand of their employers. And in some sense, it's just a basic demand for a life worth living. And an overworked economy, an economy where some have too much work and some have too little, work time reduction, sharing the work out, and giving everyone a life that's worth living. I think that's what we should be fighting for. And I'm pleased to see that Royal Mail are doing that.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Will. Having spent the weekend putting up or working on a series of slides for today, I can very much get on board with the concept of a shorter working week. So I'm now going to hand over to Miriam Brett, who's our third speaker. So Miriam is the Director of Research and Advocacy at Commonwealth. And Miriam is going to talk to us about democratising businesses and why that should be a key part of our New Deal for Workers campaign. So over to you, Miriam.
Thank you so much for having me here. Can you hear me okay? You can, excellent. It's brilliant to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's fantastic to see so much overlap and commonality between the goals and objectives argued for right now. So as Andrew mentioned, I'm mainly going to be discussing reforms needed for the company to make it democratic by design. I think this is a really interesting time to start this conversation. COVID-19 has triggered a very profound crisis of the company, and in doing so, it's exposed fault lines in its operation that stretch back decades. The company has been transformed in recent decades into an engine of wealth extraction, and this has resulted in managerial power soaring as the power of labour as well as workers' rights has been squeezed in an effort to really boost short-term profits for companies. One of the areas we've been exploring at Commonwealth is the notion of a shareholder democracy. So what we've seen is wealth and power channeled to shareholders and executives, management via dividends, via share buybacks, via share-based pay award, rather than going to workers or being reinvested in the productive capacity of the firm. Now I'm going to give an example of that. Between 2008 and 2018, the 100 largest UK domiciled non-financial companies paid out over £400 billion in dividends. That's the equivalent of 68% of their net profits over the period, an additional 61 billion in buybacks. And the ownership context of this matters so much. We can look at the recently privatised companies like Royal Mail as examples of this to see shareholder payouts that have hit £1 billion since it was sold off. Now, what's the result of this? Well, the result is that workers, companies, and the public have lost out, leaving our economy very kind of vulnerable to this crisis with income, wealth, and power intensely concentrated. And without intervention, this crisis, like so many before it, really, will likely result in a further consolidation of ownership, with distressed firms being purchased by large corporations and private equity. But importantly, none of this is inevitable. The corporation is not natural, and its current operation is by no means fixed, and we have the power to change that. This crisis has underscored the codependency of the economic from the political, and I think that's important to recognise as we look to how to reform the current approach. We can still transform the firm from an institution of extraction to something that is purposeful and democratically governed, where all of its stakeholders have a stake and say in the wealth we create in common. Now, at Commonwealth, we've advocated the following changes to large companies and also included publicly traded companies as part of this, as measures to look towards a post-crisis reconstruction. The first of this is to reshape company purpose and end shareholder primacy to ensure that the interests of shareholders do not take priority over the interests of employees. The second is to democratise corporate governance. Now, the model that we've advocated, while there are many, would look at 45% of a company board being elected by the workforce and 45% by the shareholder body, with the remainder representing social and environmental interests. That is to ensure that those interests of labour are equally represented with capital investors. Next, to look at rebalancing the power of work through, for example, and it's been mentioned here before, and I'm so pleased to see so many voices chime in, sectoral collective bargaining agreements and elected work councils with binding rights. We think an upgrade in collective bargaining and individual labour rights would improve wages and conditions for workers, but would also better equip employees and companies to respond to the rapidly changing nature of work that we're seeing just now. Next is to extend the economic franchise to workers. So looking at workers as a collective and how they could be entitled to a minimum of 25% of the total voting rights in the company, for example. Next, to allow workers a share of the profits they help create through mandatory profit sharing for workers in companies above 50 employees. Now, that may seem like a very big transition from where we're at just now, and in many ways it is, but this is already the case in many other places, and we can just look to France as an example of that being rolled out. And lastly, to democratise capital markets. So there should be co-determination in capital and pension funds with a prohibition on asset managers voting without instruction. Conscious that I don't want to take too much time here, so I'll just finish by saying that the context, particularly in the context of this crisis, there is an absolute necessity to reimagine how the company operates so that it can better serve the common good and share the wealth we create in common. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Miriam. So as I said, we will have a poll on this along with the other questions that I flagged during my presentation, but we'll have a bit of a Q&A with our three speakers first. And as I said, please do, if you've got a question for somebody, please do put it in the chat box. I think we've got a lot of questions coming through for CAD, so CAD, I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we'll see. So a number of them asking about trade union membership and how that would work with sectoral collective bargaining. So where a trade union is able to negotiate terms and conditions at a sector level, can that be used in partnership with growing membership within individual businesses? How would that work? And we also had a question about, so from David Ray, who is playing devil's advocate a bit, he said, what about free riding? So if people who aren't members of a union, would they still get the benefits of a sectoral agreement? How do we deal with that issue? So yeah, do you want to come back on those two things? And then I'll put questions to Will and Miriam as well.
Okay, yeah. Well, let's think. When collective bargaining was a lot higher, unions were a lot larger. So it doesn't necessarily follow that just because you've got the union negotiating, then people won't bother joining the union. There are other things that you do once you become engaged in the union. Once you see the union is successful, it's encouragement rather than discouragement to join. So you can take part in the discussions about terms and conditions. You can elect those people who represent you. The whole number of reasons why people still maintain their union membership, and actually you see the membership grow. In terms of free riders, well, there's always going to be people who are not going to join the union. I don't think there's anything that you can do about that. You just have to make the union attractive and show them what they get by sticking together, by being united, by having one voice. It used to be that we had such a thing as the closed shop, so anybody who went into a business had to join the union too. You might get back to that. But for where we are now, calling for sectoral collective bargaining is, I think, step one to making unions both relevant again and important in people's lives. Does that cover the membership and the free riding one?
Yep, well, our members will be the judge of that when they vote. So I'm not going to preempt that, but thanks very much, Cad. So Will, a couple of questions for you in the chat box. So there's one that Tracy Fussy has put in. So She's saying keen for a shorter working week. Who isn't? But she's asking, how do we deliver it? So what kind of policies would we have for this? And I'll also ask you if you can pick up on Tam Dewar's question as well. So he's saying, how do we achieve these advances for workers in the absence of worker-friendly governments at the moment? So Will, if you could come in on those two, please.
Two very small questions, thank you. So I think that I'm pleased to see that basically you need a mixture of public campaigning, trade unions pushing on this, and a kind of coordination of politicians from a variety of parties. Basically, I think we shouldn't forget that it is still a commitment of the Labour Party that the shorter working week as an ambition for a decade, for the next decade, that we in lieu of a Labour government and in lieu perhaps of a Labour Party that's not really doing that many policy pronouncements, we shouldn't forget that's the case. And I think if you're a Labour Party member, that's something that you should be talking about. What happened to that policy for shorter working weeks within the party? Are we still committed to that? Beyond the Labour Party, beyond the government, and I share your concern that the government is not doesn't seem to be interested in pursuing such an ambitious policy. I think we need public campaigning and trade unions pushing on this. This is something which is a win for workers, but whether you're a Conservative voter, a Labour voter, a Green Party voter, and so on, your working time issues are an issue for you. This is something which can galvanise people into trade unions, but also which is something which can speak to people's everyday experience. I think there's something about work, and I think we can all agree here that it's everyone's everyday experience, whether you have work or whether you haven't got work. It's so central in our lives that I think it's something which, if you can have a forward-thinking policy which can show the benefits to you in your life, then I think there's much potential there for public campaigning. So delivering it will always mean campaigning, pushing for it, asking employers to kind of, this is a demand to take to employers. And I think to a smaller to a smaller degree, there's also the question of that there are some employers out there who are pursuing this already. So there are employers making a business case for the 4-day week. Now, I don't think that's the strongest case, but I think it's also very useful to say, well, people say, well, how is this possible? How can we do it? Well, we can point to a range of businesses from Microsoft in Japan or from a range of businesses in the UK, which we consult with, to show that actually it is happening in companies and it's working absolutely fine. So I think a mixture of these different strategies is how we deliver that, basically.
Great, thanks, Will. And so Miriam, in the chat box then, Graham Kolk has asked, can we learn from European models where all three of these things are present? But I think actually, so what I wanted to ask you was, do we see examples of more democratic companies with workers on boards elsewhere? And picking up on Tam's question, is pointing to those kind of examples a way that we can make the case for this policy, or what kind of argument should we use when we're talking about democratizing the company? So we can get quite technical. Do we say it's about your voice having a say on the board? Do we say it's about your pay and dividends? What's the best way to argue for this?
Great question. Firstly, on examples elsewhere, I think that actually plays a really important role in helping to normalise this. And I think part of that is us recognising that the UK's economy is actually quite an extreme example of labour market deregulation, particularly compared to a lot of our European partners. And recognising that it is an odd one out in many senses, and kind of pointing to the fact that actually other countries are doing this much better than us, and there are benefits for workers, there's benefits for the environment, there's benefits for the wider economy attached to a different strategy that is normal in another country. I think kind of reflecting on that narrative and trying to kind of integrate and mainstream that into our arguments is an important component of fighting for something much bigger, because quite a lot of the time, and particularly with the crisis that we face just now, with some of the visions coming out from the left just now that are, to me, common sense, are such a kind of radical departure from what is quite an extreme economy that we have, I'd argue, in terms of like the size and scale of deregulation. That actually kind of looking towards concrete illustrations of how this is done better elsewhere. And I think that ties into your the second point of your question around how we actually frame this, I think there are many ways to frame it. Because there are frankly so many benefits to democratizing companies. The first kind of most obvious one is that there is a gross imbalance in the interest represented and the decision-making power and voting rights of capital versus labour. There's a really kind of urgent need to rebalance that and rebalance the voices that are actually represented in those decision-making structures, both with regards to kind of the actual kind of company board makeup, but also setting the wider strategy of companies going forward, whose voices are included in the room, who is involved in participating in those decision makings. So there's a real need to rebalance that power. I think there's also broader benefits to that as well, as has been highlighted through the case for sectoral bargaining, collective bargaining rights, and the need to advance those. What we tend to see is increase in workers' wages, something that has been in a chronic state in the UK for a very long time now, a 17-year wage squeeze, and enhancing broader kind of rights for working conditions for workers as well. Just now, I think there's also a need, as we kind of look to focus our kind of post-crisis reconstruction, wherever that may be, to actually argue this is the case for just building a much more resilient, fairer and better equipped economy. As it stands just now, the gross imbalances in wealth and power in our economy have created fault lines, fractures and massive vulnerabilities that have been embedded into the makeup of that economy. And we're seeing the ramifications of that play out just now in many ways. And I think the kind of narrative and an argument for democratizing the company is about building resilience into our broader economy by making the firm democratic by design.
Brilliant, thank you, Miriam. So Roy Wemborne has posted in the chat, shareholders will vote for the best way to achieve what makes them the most money, not what's in the interest of the company. They should have no board representation. Boards should be made up of workers or customers and other genuine stakeholders. So I think we'll class Roy down, we'll put him down in the support column for you. And that's certainly, Roy, what we were pushing. So when we were talking about public ownership of Royal Mail, BT, and looking at the future of the post office, these were things that we were talking to the Labour Party about, designing exactly that kind of model. So hopefully, and thank you very much to our speakers, hopefully if Chris is there, we can give everybody now a poll and we'll be able to vote on this. So Chris, can we get the polls up now?
Yeah, which one did you want first, buddy?
So I think first, if we do, so if we have a poll on sectoral collective bargaining, shorter working week and democratising the company.
Okay, my friend.
Actually, because we're voting on it, it's probably more X Factor than Dragon's Den.
Let's go for it. People should have that now, Andrew.
Yep, great. So that should be up on everybody's screen. Shorter working week, taking a quickly. See, I like this. You get it in real time.
Yeah, it's like a horse race.
Yeah. I don't think I'm able to vote, Chris, so I've been barred.
This is very exciting.
Oh, it's very tight, look.
Yeah, so I think it's probably worth saying, just as we all stare and watch numbers on a screen like financial traders, that all three of these policies that we've talked about today, so a shorter working week, sectoral collective bargaining, democratizing businesses, the reason that we had these three ideas being pitched to us by three expert speakers is really because these are three things that we have pushed as part of the New Deal for Workers. And it's not really, from our point of view, an either or, but hopefully, it's these are all things that we are very keen to keep on pushing. But hopefully, by having these, three great speakers today, then it's engaged people a bit more in the debate. And clearly we can see, so sectoral collective bargaining and shorter working week, joint first place, and democratizing businesses is.
We've just to let you know, Andrew, we've got 87% of people watch. So if you want to give one last shout out, I can close the poll and then share it, and everyone will be able to see the result.
Right. Okay. Maybe that's just me seeing it. Yeah. So one last chance to vote. If you've got the poll in front of you, now is the time to do so. because Chris is going to close that in a couple of seconds. So I think that's probably time, Chris, if you're good.
No worries, mate.
So can we see the results of that?
There you go. Should be seeing them, yeah?
Oh, a late surge. So shorter working week comes out on top there. Well done, Will. Well done, autonomy. So as I say, I think we've got a comment in the chat from, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Prince Kingsley Faberode. And apologies if I've got that slightly wrong. So he's saying, I think all three of them are all 100% needed. So I think we'd agree with that. And I just want to kind of finally thank our three guest speakers. We'll now kind of move on to the next part of the session. Thank you to Cad, thank you to Will, thank you to Miriam. And please do check out, so IER, the Institute of Employment Rights, please check out Autonomy, and please check out Commonwealth on Twitter, on social media. If you want to post links to your websites or your social media profiles in the chat box, please do so. And I'd encourage people to follow them and look at the work that they're doing. So Chris, if we can also now do the other polls.
Yep, no problem.
So they should come up on screen.
There you go.
Okay, so the first question was who described the past decade as a jobs miracle? So you can vote on, was it Rishi Sunak, Sajid Javid, Philip Hammond, George Osborne, or the rogue one, all of the above? And then we're keen to know, so what do you think is currently the most important issue for CWU members at work? So we can so that informs what we campaign for as part of a New Deal for Workers. And then the final one is, what do you think we need to be focusing on in the campaign for a New Deal for Workers? So that may not necessarily be the issue that is affecting our members at work, but it may be something you think actually, in terms of a public campaign, that is the thing that we should be putting front and center of it. So that poll will run in the background, but what I'm going to do now is hand over to Dave Ward, and Dave is going to speak for a little bit about hopefully the next steps of the campaign and where we go from here. And then in about 10 minutes, we'll have the speech from Gordon Brown that we'll put on. So I'll hand over to Dave now, and that poll will just run in the background. So please do vote in that.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I'd also like to thank Cad, Will and Miriam, all from organisations that we've been working with on the New Deal. So, hopefully you'll see that there's a lot more thought gone into what we've been talking about, that we're actually building a connection between all of the issues. So the right answer was, of course, that they're all important and they all need to feature part of the New Deal. So how are we going to take the New Deal campaign forward? I think there's a few things that we can definitely do. The first one is that within our own union, we want to build trade unionism in its widest possible context. So I did say in standing again for re-election as your General Secretary that we're a great union, but it's important that we don't see the problems that we face in an insular way, i.e. in this bit of the union or that bit of the union. We're going to have an industrial session later on today. What must be apparent to everybody is that we're all facing pretty much the same type of threats to jobs going forward and our pay terms and conditions. So I want to see our regions take these debates on. I want to see regions where we already have an inbuilt one union culture coming together to utilise the New Deal campaign in talking to other trade unionists in your area. So we need to get in at the grassroots levels of trade unions, and we need to get other trade unionists who supporting this campaign. We need to get other political figures supporting the campaign for a New Deal. And I'm particularly interested, why I talk about decentralisation of the union. I think that for the labour movement and for the future of workers, when we're not in power directly in a general election, it's how we operate in regions that will gain us back that power. So, for example, there's devolved assemblies, there's regional mayors, many of whom our labour movement figures. And you guys out there can start getting into contact with all of these people to bring us all together on a new deal for workers. So there's a role for our trade union. There's a role for our trade union in looking at our own contracts of employment in our own industries and making sure that the issues the union is pushing wider, that we're also tackling those in our own areas as part of our own bargaining. But let me turn to 3 specifics that we've put on the table for the TUC, where we're pushing a wider New Deal campaign. So the first one is we should be pushing now common bargaining agendas in sectors of the economy. CAD set out very clearly the benefits of that and also a plan. So we're working with the Institute of Employment Rights. We're approaching other trade unions in sectors of the economy who work in the areas where our members work. And we're saying, let's sign up to a deal to raise employment standards in those sectors of the economy. Let's create the race to the top, and let's change the world of work for everybody who works in that part of the economy. So for example, I'll use this in the post and logistics sector. The same will apply to the telecommunications sector. But we know we face some immediate problems with companies like Amazon, DHL, Hermes, all of these people who are competing. We fought to set the benchmark for high pay terms and conditions over many years. They are non-unionised or very low union density operators. So we've got to work together with those unions. We've got to set out what the common bargaining agenda is. And we're actively doing that at the moment. And you'll hear about that in the very near future. That'll be on pay for the sector, on working hours for the sector, on how we use automation, on the contractual status of employees within the sector. So my point always is we can make that change happen now. We don't have to wait for it. And that's the role of a trade union. The second thing that we're doing is we're now beginning to intensify the debate amongst the TUC through motions that we've put to Congress about what is the manifesto for working people, for trade unions. We all have our different issues that we have to deal with at the moment. We all focus on protecting various members and different members in our different unions and their jobs, their terms and conditions. But we must agree a collective charter, a narrative of what are the key demands. Let's say there's 10 of them that we can put on the table that everybody can sign up to. Now, some of what we've been talking about here are some of those demands. So common bargaining agendas is one of them. If we look at higher pay, we should be setting standards of pay now and calling for higher pay, building on key workers, calling for a re-evaluation of pay based on what society needs, not what employers at the top and the bosses need and the market needs. And I think we would get through to people if we included those simple messages to build on what key workers have done during this pandemic. We need to end insecurity of work. And that means changing the contractual status of employees and saying that the norm needs to get back to proper contracts of employment with holiday pay, with sick pay, with proper wages for unsocial attendance patterns. And I think, again, that would resonate. We need to challenge technology and we need to find a way of slowing down the intensification of work. So when we talk about working time, we should also be talking about 4-day weeks, not just seeing working time as an hourly issue, but changing the life balance between work and our families, because the fourth industrial revolution is coming now. And we need to make these demands now. I always use this in the 80s. I remember there used to be a debate that said new technology is going to come. We're all going to have more pay. We're all going to have more leisure time to spend it. And, I always say, what the hell happened? So we need to refresh those debates. We're entitled to make these demands. And I think that society will be open to this because the world is changing. The pandemic's changing it, climate change. is changing it. And, you know, we should be making these arguments now as part of the New Deal. So the charter of what is actually going to be included in the New Deal is crucial. And I missed one point, Miriam's point. We've got to change the imbalance of power in the world of work. We should be pushing new models of ownership for workers in big companies, which is exactly what the CWU is doing. So the second thing we can do at the TUC is agree that charter. And I'm saying to trade union leaders, let's sit in a room and let's get that charter worked out. Let's get it communicated out to all of our various members and get some profile around a manifesto for a new deal for workers. The third thing we have to do is mobilise workers. You're going to hear me keep saying this. I know it's difficult during COVID, but BLM has cut through as a campaign. It's cut through society. Extinction Rebellion have found ways of cutting through. Well, making the world of work the key political issue is our job as trade unions. So we've said to the TUC, and it was agreed at the Congress, we must now sit down in the same room and agree a mobilisation strategy behind our New Deal for Workers campaign. So that's where we are. We'll continue to move that forward. Looking forward now for to hear what Gordon's got to say.
Brilliant, thanks, Dave. I'm just going to see before we do that if we can get the poll results up, Chris. So, yeah, here we go. Everybody should be able to see the results on the screen. So you're absolutely right on the jobs miracle. It was all of the above. So that shows you the ideology that we're up against when each one of the past 4 chancellors actually think that we've seen a jobs miracle and things are quite as bad as we've set out today. Interesting on question 2 that job security is way out in front, and I imagine that reflects exactly what we're seeing in both Royal Mail and BT at the moment and the campaigns that we've got running there. So that is really striking to see that quite so far ahead. I think when we've done this in the past, we've seen pay in particular being high up. So, you know, it probably also reflects the climate that we're in with coronavirus and people who have got serious concerns about their job security at the moment. And then finally, what should we be focusing on in the campaign for a New Deal for Workers? Trade union rights and voice at work. And that is something, of course, so with sectoral collective bargaining, looking at democratizing companies, all of these issues, these are ones that, you know, we're really keen to take forward. And of course, you know, repeal of the anti-trade union legislation. So the 2016 Trade Union Act, you know, the kind of rules that have tripped us up in Royal Mail with the injunction, the rules that have allowed, as I said earlier, you know, union busting and derecognition in Virgin. So all of those are things that we're really keen to kind of pick up. And I'll just before Gordon comes on, Dave, I wonder if you've got any thoughts on those results and how we build our charter around that and make sure that we take account of what the input we've got from people today.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what these sessions are about. So in the final session of our 3-day event, we'll be reflecting on some of the poll results. We'll be pulling that together and we'll be letting branches and representatives know exactly how we're going to take their views into account as we take these policies forward.
Okay, thanks, Dave. And as Dave said, so in the past, we've put forward a list of policies and suggestions which make up a New Deal for Workers. And so we will be putting out more communications following on from this that talk about that set of rights. But as I said at the start of my presentation, so from our point of view, you know, a New Deal for Workers, it falls into a number of different areas. So, you know, we've talked about ending insecure employment, we've talked about the balance of forces, we've talked about shifting reward to working people. And the other thing, you know, that is really crucial for us is that as we face a time of impending economic crisis and huge unemployment, you know, clearly we need significant government investment in programs that protect security of incomes, protect and promote jobs in the future. And this is something that that a number of trade unions have been pushing. And we're delighted today that we do have the former Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, joining us. Gordon has been instrumental recently in bringing people together to argue for full employment, and has been doing some work that he's going to tell us about, building the Alliance for Full Employment. So Dave, I'll just hand over to you to introduce Gordon, and shortly after that we'll play the speech that he's done for us today.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have Gordon Brown with us this afternoon. And I think that the work that Gordon has done in the last few weeks to set out really the scale of the jobs crisis that we face, the economic crisis, and as I keep saying, why we must now make the world of work the #1 political issue, is a credit to his knowledge, obviously. When we were talking about this last week, we haven't always agreed on everything, but Gordon is, in my view, a heavyweight in terms of understanding the economy, putting forward solutions, and I know that he is totally committed at the moment to really becoming for the movement, I suppose, a figure like Tony Benn was for many years, but in terms of the future world of work, what we now need to do to rebalance the forces in the world of work. So it's a pleasure to have Gordon with us. We're going to see a video from him. Then we're going to have an opportunity to talk about that. As I understand it, I think there's a lot of interest from the media as well on this particular session. So welcome, Gordon.
Let me thank this great union for inviting me to your online conference. And let me start by congratulating each and every one of your 190,000 members for what you have achieved and are achieving in this crisis, at a time when so many millions of people have come to rely even more on telecommunications, on the postal services, on our local post offices. Let me express my gratitude and the country's gratitude for the work you've done to help people, for the daily contribution you make to keeping our society and the economy moving, and for the selfless public service you have given individually and collectively as a union. You have had to keep working at some risk to your health. And even when most of the country has been locked down, you've been at the center of the maintenance and continuation of services our country needs more than ever and cannot survive without. And while you've been helping the country, it's regrettable that in recent times, BT has shamefully continued with its policy of imposing its first compulsory redundancies since its establishment as BT in 1984, 36 years ago. This threat is one of the reasons why I want to speak today about how our new Alliance for Full Employment can bring the working people of our country together to fight for jobs. But let me also start by thanking you and congratulating you on your continuing support for Labour and for our new leader, Keir Starmer, who, up against an incompetent, shambolic government, U-turning on lockdowns, U-turning on testing, U-turning on social distancing, U-turning on the return to work, he has had to be not just the successful leader of the opposition, but as befits his training as a lawyer, the successful leader of the prosecution to get things done. I'm here today at the invitation of my friend Dave Ward to talk to you about the new Alliance for Full Employment that the Welsh First Minister, the Mayor of London, the Metro Mayors of Newcastle, Manchester, Sheffield, Bristol and Liverpool city regions, and nearly 2,000 councillors have formed with the trades unions and business to propose how we can work together in cooperation and solidarity to save jobs. We have to act because already unemployment is set to rise towards 3 million, to 10%. And despite all of us saying Black Lives Matter, unemployment in ethnic communities is rising towards 20%. Youth unemployment may get up to 30%. Among 18 and 19-year-olds not in education, up to 40 or even 50%. Just think of your chances today of getting a new job if you lose your old one. 1,000 to 1 against in London, where there were 1,000 applicants for just one receptionist job in that city. 1,500 to 1 against in Coventry, where 1,500 people were chasing only one administrative job. In Birmingham, where 5,000 went for just 10 assembly jobs. 2,500 to 1 against in Sunderland, with 2,500 queuing for a single factory job. 2,900 to 1 against in Northumberland, where 2,900 people applied for just one warehouse job. Odds against, more like the national lottery than a normal labour market. But I say to you, mass unemployment is not the inevitable result of COVID-19. It is avoidable, it is preventable. It depends on the decisions governments make. But of course, this government is more likely to blame others for what's wrong than attempt to put things right, blaming everyone but themselves. When I met Lula, the then president of Brazil, during the financial crisis, he told me that when he was a trade union shop steward and people said, the country's in crisis, who's to blame? He always replied, blame the government. When he became general secretary of the Brazilian Trades Union and people said, the country's still in crisis, who's to blame? He said, always blame the government. When he became the leader of the opposition and they said, the country's in a mess, who's to blame? He said, the government. And then he paused and said, then I became the government. So when people said the country's in crisis, who's to blame? I said, blame America. But while this government refuses to blame America, it blames everyone else. It blames the experts, it blames the civil servants, it blames the doctors, it blames the British people for not obeying them. Everyone but themselves. On every other occasion, Boris Johnson favours the use of Latin words from classical literature, but the two most famous Latin words, mea culpa, I'm to blame, never passes his lips. But even if this government will do little and not accept the blame, we will not walk by on the other side. It is now for us as a labour movement to come together in solidarity and force a change of approach to the mounting list of redundancies and closures. Regions, nations, workers, managers, voluntary organisations, faith groups come together to force that change of policy. For we know that when people come together in trade unions, we achieve far more working together than we can ever do in isolation. When people join together in the cooperative movement, we show who at our best we really are. That yes, we cooperate out of need, but yes, too, we have a human need to cooperate. When regions and nations come together, we show just how much our unity gives us strength. And when we unite, there is nothing that by our shared endeavour, we together cannot achieve. Now, when I spoke to the Labour conference last week in the wake of 700,000 redundancies this summer, and 1,000 more jobs at risk after October the 31st when the furlough scheme ends, I urged the Chancellor to bring forward a new economic recovery plan within days. And I would like to have welcomed the same kind of intervention to save jobs that we saw in March after the TUC and others pressed for it. But we find that in his jobs plan of last Thursday, he fell short. Nothing new for the 1.5 million of our fellow workers who are currently unemployed. Nothing new for the 900,000 on universal credit not working at the moment who will soon be registered as unemployed. Nothing new for all those excluded as self-employed from any help in the last 6 months. And last week, shamefully, nothing new for the 1.5 million young people under 25 who are not in education, training or work, at least 500,000 of whom will not benefit from the government's Kickstart programme, which lasts only 6 months and is only 24 hours a week for each young person. So even after taking additional apprenticeships and traineeships and college places into account, the government's programme covers too few of the young leaving just at the start of their working lives, a lost COVID generation of young people condemned to a no work, no hope future on the streets or isolated in their homes when they need not just training and work experience, but the same help we gave in the crisis in 2009 with job search and with support for their wages when employers take them on. And you know, in the plan last week, there was nothing new for the struggling town centres and high streets that would, if a plan was pursued, keep post offices open. There was nothing new to speed up the infrastructure programme, which you have championed and the TUC have supported. And there was nothing to speed up the full fibre broadband investment the country desperately needs now to stay ahead of our competitors. And of course, in the Chancellor's plan for part-time work, that he said was modelled on the schemes the unions play a part in running in Germany and other countries in Europe. He failed to give the much-needed lifeline for the 4 million still on furlough by introducing a scheme that means he will pay only 23% of wages of the part-time workforce, where in Germany the government pays 60% and in other countries at times 70%. The government assumes that the new part-time worker will take a 22% cut in wages, but the employer, who unlike Germany, France or Denmark has to pay 55% of the wages, will find it cheaper to hire one full-time worker than to keep on 2 part-time workers for the next 6 months. So sadly, we face job losses, mounting unemployment, and a wave of business bankruptcies. And that is why we have formed the New Alliance for Full Employment. For with a bad Brexit hitting the poorest hardest, and the north-south divide growing, not narrowing, we have a government that is one rule for the Downing Street elite, another rule for the rest of us. One rule for the haves, with the government unfreezing the dividend payouts for millionaires. Another rule for the have-nots, with the same government freezing the pay of millions on the lowest wages. And so it falls to us to bring a divided country together and to make hope come alive. And we can conquer mass unemployment. First, because most of the 4 million on furlough will never benefit from the inadequate cost-cutting programme of job support announced by the Chancellor. We propose to replace it in the way the Germans and the French and the Danes have done, to make it worthwhile to keep on 2 workers where currently they'd keep only 1, with proper wage support and without forcing a 22% wage cut on some of the lowest paid earners in the country. And we must also give support by making up the wages of those who are told to stay at home in local lockdowns. Currently, they lose most of their household incomes because they are not in work, and that has to change. And then secondly, we must help the young get work. There are 3.5 million young people under 25, 1.5 million who are looking for work at the moment, but only 350,000 places on Kickstart and 20,000 traineeships. So we have got to make provision for what we estimate will be the 500,000 on the street and another 200,000 with nothing to do after 6 months on Kickstart. And what we mean by helping young people is not job substitution. Helping the young unemployed cannot be at the expense of making current older workers unemployed in the process. Many of you will remember the 1980s when so many young people lost out, scarring their lives for a generation. We have to give young out of work men and women who will become the 21st century's lost COVID generation if we do not act, not just training and work experience, but help to search for a job and wage support when employers take them on. And third, we need to do what you have been advocating for years, advance the infrastructure program, and on top of the 5 billion of public investment in the rollout of full fibre broadband, which your union has supported, deliver the additional 3.5 billion in public investment that the TUC and you want brought forward this year. That has the possibility of creating 40,000 new jobs. And then fourth, we've got to revive our high streets and town centres that have been devastated by the loss of trade and the growth of alternative forms of shopping. And one central feature of every good high street and town centre has been the local post office. Fifth, we need a Green New Deal, not just harnessing solar power, but harnessing wind, wave and hydrogen power that Britain has the potential to be a world leader in. And we should not be abandoning job-creating European programs like the European Green Deal, nor Horizon with its investment in innovation, nor Erasmus that helps young people get skills, nor the European Investment Bank, which has invested in the regions billions in our infrastructure. And finally, we have got to ensure that those who have served the country best during this crisis, including those on the lowest paid wages and on zero-hour contracts, ensure that they are properly protected in the future. So it is for us to campaign for the same security of work and conditions that you have fought for, as too many jobs have been outsourced, deunionized, and made subject to agency work and zero-hour contracts, with the result that people have been taking risks with their health when, as the crisis shows, we need proper security. So let's fight and argue for better conditions of employment so that those who have been saving the country are not rewarded with poorer conditions of work, but of proper remuneration. And just think of the change we can achieve by working together. We fight the same virus, the same economic recession, the same battle against poverty, low pay, unemployment, homelessness and squalor. And we win it when we do so by working together. For me, solidarity comes from feeling the pain of others. It starts with believing in something bigger than yourself. And it is only through solidarity across our whole country, not nation fighting nation, north fighting south, not one nation breaking away and going it alone, but over the last 100 years, we, the Labour movement, built an NHS free to all, based on need, irrespective of nationality. We built the same rights to a pension wherever you lived. We guaranteed every worker in every nation a national minimum wage and a basic pension, no matter what the local conditions were. And we created a welfare state that in every part of our country was designed to take the shame out of need. And so we should oppose any breakdown of that solidarity that comes with nationalism and nation fighting nation. For I tell you, and I speak as a proud Scot, that we Scots cannot be secure. We're not just millions of Scots children, but millions of English, Welsh and Northern Irish children are insecure. Just as all of you who are English or Welsh cannot feel comfortable or at ease when millions of English and Welsh pensioners live their lives without comfort and ill at ease. That's why the biggest majority in Scotland is not for independence, but for cooperation between the working people of both countries to solve problems that cannot be solved in isolation, but can be solved only by working together. You know, more than 100 years ago, workers came together, first a few, then thousands, then millions, to form the labour movement we know today. And their struggles, their sacrifices, and their achievements, what we've just talked about, a welfare state, an NHS, a living wage, for a time full employment, must convince us to redouble our efforts to achieve in our lifetime the fairer, more equal, more compassionate society that our pioneers dreamed of. And we can achieve this. They never stopped believing that by acting in solidarity with each other, we could create a better world. And we too must never stop believing in the fairer future that together we can build.
Hi, Gordon. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yeah, that was a very inspirational message, and really pleased to have you with us live now, and to talk about your...
And to talk to you a few days ago about this campaign for full employment. I really do want to work together with everybody who feels that we can do something about it.
Yeah, and I mean, listening to your message there, I think it resonates with what we've been saying, which is, you know, we can make change happen. You know, we can bring workers together. And one of the things I've been saying earlier on today is that I do believe we're facing the biggest jobs and economic crisis in our lifetime, not just because of the pandemic that's created lots of issues for us, but because it's colliding with other massive issues. The starting point of the economy, the labour market that's been decades in the making, is fundamentally broken at the moment. And, you know, if we look at we're on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, we're facing hard choices over climate change. We have to move up the agenda of the world of work. You know, we want to work with you. I understand completely the point you're making about bringing the labour movement together, devolved assemblies, metro mayors, politicians, and trade unions. My view is that trade unions can do something about this by working together with the New Deal campaign. So, you know, interested in what your view is at the moment with regard to the call for a jobs alliance, for a full employment plan, interested in how you're going to put that on the agenda with the media, with the government, because we need it, you know, badly now. We need to take action to change things.
Well, yours is a great union. I've always enjoyed working with you, and I know that you campaign effectively. And I think that's what's needed now. You see, if one part of Britain, one mayor or one First Minister in Wales or Scotland did something and pressed for some change, they might not make a difference. But if we all came together, we can actually make a difference. So I've been talking to the Mayor of Manchester, Andy Burnham, Steve Rutherham in Liverpool, Jamie Driscoll in Newcastle, Dan Jarvis in Sheffield, Marvin in Bristol, Sadiq in London, the First Minister of Wales, Mark Drakeford. I've then been talking to you and to other trade union leaders, Len McCluskey, the GMB, USDA, and so on and so forth. And there is a willingness to come together to do something about this. And I do not feel that a chancellor and a government that is so out of touch as this one is can fail to be moved if we can actually unite together. I'm talking to the churches and faith groups as well, because I think they can be involved, the voluntary organizations, And if we have a clear idea of what needs to be done, and I believe that we are doing less than half as much as Germany is about to do, France is about to do, probably a quarter of what even Republican America would do, because they're planning a 1 to 2 trillion stimulus. I believe that we can actually get action. We need to get this plan of last week rewritten. We need to do something that will keep people in jobs instead of making it incentivizing employers to lay people off, which this present part-time work scheme does. And of course, we've got to do something, as I said, about youth unemployment, because let us not return to these terrible days of the 1980s when young people had no hope.
Yeah, Gordon, given the scale of the crisis we face, it does feel that the government's plan that they've just introduced feels more akin to putting a sticky plaster over a gaping wound. And what we need is a bridge to the future. And one of my criticisms of the government at the moment would be that, you know, they seem to see everything through the lens of party political, situations. And we should be talking about a national job summit. We should be talking about a recovery council where employers, trade unions, all the organisations come together. And this government has got to open itself up to other people's views if we're going to build a bridge to the future. So how do you see that coming about?
Right. There should be a summit. You should bring together all the mayors, the trade unions, business organisations, and we should discuss one by one what's going to be done about young people, what's going to be done about part-time work, what's going to be done about infrastructure, what's going to be done about the Green New Deal. And we could go through an agenda where I believe that most people in this country understand that when you've got a once-in-a-century event, because this is a once-in-a-century event, you've got to take extraordinary action. And you can't just take it for 6 months. You've got to take it to see through to the end of this. You know, in Germany and France, the part-time workers scheme goes right through to the end of 2021. This inadequate scheme that was announced last week, which doesn't incentivize employers to take people on, is only for 6 months. And so Germany and France are putting more money in the next period because they understand that you're never going to get back to full economic activity in most sectors for some time as a result of the health problems we now have, but also as a result of the damage to consumer spending and everything else in the economy. But you know, if we allow unemployment to rise, then demand will fall in the economy. It's the old Keynesian truth that if the private sector can't invest, the public sector has got to come in and make it possible for people to stay in jobs. But if people are unemployed, let's say it goes up to 3 million, that's 3 million consumers who are spending a far less than they were before, all their families, demand falls, and all the services on which we depend, they start to lose custom, and therefore they lose jobs. So you're at a sort of turning point in a way that as you start to make for a recovery, if you take the wrong decision, and I think he took the wrong decision last week, you actually push people out of work. But if you take the right decision, you keep demand in the economy moving forward and keep people in jobs. So as you say, look, you know, I said it's a one in a century event, but it's also, as you know, big structural changes in the economy. I mean, we are going online, which is to the benefit, I hope, of members of the Communication Workers Union. There are going to be online health services, online education services, as well as online retail services. Logistics is going to matter more because people will want deliveries. And we've got to watch that this is not a 0 hours economy, as it seems to be becoming with some employers. So all these things have got to be looked at. Call a summit of jobs. Call, as Francis O'Grady has done, for a Council for Economic Recovery. We had that in 2009 when we consulted widely over our future jobs plan. And don't do what they did in the 1980s, cheap schemes that you know are not going to make the difference. Do it properly, as I think we did with the full, with the future jobs plan in 2009.
Hi, sorry, Dave, you've been muted. Hi, Gordon. It's
You can throw the questions in, Andrew.
Sorry, Dave. I'm going to jump in to give our members the chance to ask questions, Gordon. So thank you very much for joining us. We've got over 160 of our members who've been watching this session, and it's really a privilege to have you here talking to us today. The first question that I'd like to ask is from one of our members called Brian Kenny, and it's been really nice to hear, the kind of optimistic message, but he's asking, are we ever going to achieve full employment under a Tory government? So I suppose there's that question, and do you feel that the campaign now, has it got a chance of success after the announcement last week? There seems to be a bit of criticism and pressure growing around it.
Yeah, we talked about this some time ago. Is it full employment or full and fulfilling employment? Because we cannot just have employment based on 0-hour contracts and paying people poverty wages. We've got to have full employment that actually means something for families, that they get a decent income from working. And that is not the case under the Conservative government, and hasn't been the case for the last 10 years. So we've got to do better than that. Yes, I'm optimistic that we can do something. If you take the northern seats in the country that the Conservative Party won at the election, they don't know, these new MPs, what people are thinking in their own constituencies yet about employment and about the health service and about the welfare state and about the digital infrastructure. We have got to see that local people, local union members are telling these new MPs that they may have got a vote on the basis of Brexit, but they haven't got a vote for a conservative or neoliberal or right-wing economic policy. And we've got to persuade these MPs that if they want to mean anything to the constituencies, they've got to start thinking about how they can join us in helping create jobs. I believe that many Conservatives who are disenchanted with the government's policy will want to join our campaign.
Excellent, thank you. And we've had a number of questions coming through from our members about where the Labour Party is. So firstly, whether the Labour Party at the moment is supporting your campaign and the efforts. Obviously, there's a lot of support at local level. And we've also had a number of questions from our members asking, how does Labour reconnect with voters, particularly in Scotland? And could the plan that you're pushing, could that be part of it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I've talked to Keir Starmer about this, and I've also talked to Annalise Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor, and they're very keen to work in support of the Alliance for Full Employment. And actually, Annalise ran over the summer the Jobs, Jobs, Jobs campaign, which was to highlight the importance of employment. So I'm not trying to impose any particular policy on anyone on this, because unions have their own policy. The Labour Party is developing its policy at the moment. Faith groups will have their own views have got to be done. I'm just highlighting themes where it's important that we take action. And yes, Keir Starmer and Annalise Dodds are doing a great job, and I want to work very closely with them. As far as Scotland is concerned, I worry about Scotland because I think to some extent we've lost the solidarity that we need for the future. You see, the Scottish government makes a virtue of going it alone. It makes a virtue of doing everything themselves. It doesn't want to cooperate with the rest of the United Kingdom, whether it's on health or whether it's on jobs or whether it's on the environment. It wants to go it alone. And, we did a poll, because we've got an organisation called Our Scottish Future, which is looking at the future of Scotland. And we did a poll and we found that 75% of Scots actually wanted, as I said in the speech I did earlier, 75% wanted to cooperate with the North, with the Midlands, with Wales, with Northern Ireland, with London. They wanted to cooperate because they know that we can't solve the problem of unemployment, one nation doing it itself. We've got to work together. We can't solve the problem of climate change, certainly, without people coming together in all countries. And we can't actually solve some of these health problems without an agreement about what's the best form of, if you like, multiplying the number of tests. Because I think we're going to have millions of tests done every week, not just thousands. And we need to have a common testing approach, because I think it's a saliva test that's going to be developed that can give a result in a few minutes. And that will make a huge difference to people's ability to decide whether they can work, to decide whether they need a further checkup and everything else. And that could make a difference. So my whole ethos is cooperation, solidarity are really important to dealing with the major challenges we face. And therefore, I can't understand the philosophy that says we're better off isolating ourselves, better off separating ourselves off, better off getting rid of our connections, particularly our connections in the labour movement in the United Kingdom, where because we've worked together over 100 years, we didn't have a Scottish welfare state or an English financing of the health service. We financed the health service throughout the whole of the United Kingdom, and we had a welfare state that was for the whole of the UK. So no matter where you live, no matter what your income, no matter what your illness, whatever you're suffering from, the same level of help is available, usually free of charge in the health service, of course, to everybody who needs it, and free to all those who need help from the country as a whole.
That's great, thank you. So on this session as a whole, we've been talking about the problems that we've seen in the world of work, and it was really great to hear you say not just full employment, but fulfilling employment. And one of the ways that we know we're seeing different councils pursuing that is with the community wealth building model. And we've got a question from Tam Dewar, who's asked, so in Scotland, North Ayrshire Council has adopted the Preston model, where they're looking at, so community wealth building initiatives, looking at measures on procurement. Do you think this is the path that Labour councils should be looking at? Do we need to change procurement rules in order to do these sorts of things in the future?
Yeah, I've always been interested in how we can make it possible for people locally to benefit from procurement contracts that are issued by councils or by devolved governments or by the UK as a whole. And I think what is happening in Ayrshire, what's happening in Lancashire, what's happening in other parts of the countries is that in the absence of innovation from the government itself, local councillors are taking the lead and are being innovative in how they manage the resources of their own community, and of course how they can create jobs in the local community while doing work that is of benefit to the local community. And certainly if we're talking about the high streets and town centres, if we're talking about infrastructure where you desperately need to link up community facilities, for example, to the digital network, we need more of that local initiative now. But of course, we need the government to be supportive of it rather than to cut local funding and making it less easy to do. So we need local initiative, but we need national support.
That's great, thank you. So one of our young members, who's a representative on our NEC, Luke Elgar, has a question. So in the rest of Europe, we see trade unions being more respected and playing a greater role across the political spectrum. What do unions in the UK need to do in order to combat a uniquely hostile environment here?
Well, ironically, it was Ernest Bevin, who was the head of the Unite, or the TNG in the 1930s, who became the Minister for Labour in the Second World War, and then Foreign Secretary, who devised the system in Germany, which is based on co-decision making, where employees have a far bigger role in the management of their firms. And you see the part-time work scheme that's been introduced in Germany. So you do your part-time work, the government pays the rest, not like what's proposed last week, the government only pays 22%. The government pays the rest, and that's monitored by the local trade union and workers' representatives on the shop floor. So you've got co-decision making, you've got cooperation, you've got things working together. And I still believe that this government is not listening enough to the voices of trade unions. When they did last March, and the trade union movement was brought in to help shape the furlough program, it did work. But this program that's been announced only a few days ago seems to have been the subject of very little consultation. I talked to union leaders who've not been brought into these discussions when they should have been, whether it's from the Communication Workers Union or Unite or GMB and so on. There hasn't been the same level of consultation. So yes, we need trade unionists to be taken more seriously by governments. But the way we'll be taken more serious, let's be honest, is if we organise better together. And we've got to get together and fight campaigns that we can win. And I believe on jobs, we can actually win campaigns and show the relevance of trade unionism in this country, as well as the relevance of the entire labour movement, working with faith organisations and voluntary organisations as well.
Absolutely. So we like to hear the importance of organising. And that brings me kind of nicely onto a question from Emma McBride. And whenever we engage with our members, we do like to be able to say, you know, what their role is in a campaign and what the ask is of them. And I'll bring Dave in first, and then come back to you, Gordon, if that's okay. So Emma has asked, how can we really make a difference? What practically can we do to make our voices heard? And in particular, she's got a Conservative MP. So firstly, Dave, what can she do as a CWU member? What is the union going to do in terms of this campaign? And also then on to Gordon, what is the ask of individuals who are watching this? What can we do to help and get behind the campaign?
I think, Emma, the first thing you can do is ask to see your MP, not just write to them. I know that's difficult at the moment, but I think you've got to, get people in your local community on the same line, putting pressure on the MP to, talk about what is really going on with jobs and the economy, and to make the points that Gordon's made, that the plan that the government has put forward is just simply not good enough. I think the other thing, obviously, is to get behind our New Deal for Workers campaign, to talk to other trade unionists that and get them to talk to their trade union leaders about supporting the New Deal for Workers campaign. From our perspective, we'll be fully behind Gordon's plan for the Alliance for Full Employment, and we'll be working with Gordon and other political figures to bring that about. So, it's time for all of us, I think. I keep saying this in this session, but we really do need to, one, understand the scale of the jobs and economic crisis that we're going to face, and we need to now make this the #1 political issue.
Well, Dave and I are in total agreement, and Emma, it's the best question to ask. What do we do now? Because if we just talk about it, we'll not make the difference. If we just go out on our own as individuals, we can't make the change. If we can work together, however, we can make a huge difference. So Dave is helping us with this. The Alliance for Full Employment has got a website that I hope you will join. Nearly 2,000 councillors have now signed up to help us on this campaign. I'm talking to all the faith organisations tomorrow at a special Zoom session. And Emma, you can, as Dave says, and everybody who's got a member of parliament, contact them directly, in whatever way you can. If you can get a meeting, as Dave says, all the best. And then, of course, you can work with local community groups to raise the profile of those worried about employment. Work with, obviously, local organisations like the faith groups and churches, who I believe will take up this campaign. And so we make it a community-wide campaign where everybody is involved in saying, look, when you've got a 1 in a century event, so 1 in 100 years this is happening, you've got to take extraordinary measures, and you cannot just leave things as they are. We cannot willingly allow this government to leave millions of people unemployed and without hope, when we know that we can build a better economy for the future. Take your infrastructure drive. I mean, if 40,000 jobs can be created by advancing the expenditure on infrastructure, then we're benefiting the community, and at the same time, we're keeping people or getting people into work. If we can retain some of the services in the high streets and town centres by people being encouraged to support them, maybe the Chancellor should have a scheme similar to his restaurant scheme for shops, so that we can actually get people into our high streets and town centres when the restrictions are eased. Then we can actually save jobs and also, of course, benefit individual citizens. If we can deal with the problem of poverty, child poverty is going to grow enormously as a result of this crisis. And I feel so sorry that families are not being given the proper information, that the numbers of children in poverty are going to rise substantially. Then we have to act on universal credit and on tax credits, and we have to make them far fairer and make sure that families are better protected. So if we organise around specific demands, then I think we'll not only achieve many of them, but bring back this sense of hope and dynamism to everything that we do to change the nature of policy in this country.
Thank you. So I think we're just now needing to wrap up because we're coming to the end of the session. So I'd just like to say thank you to everybody who's been on it. And in particular, thank you, Gordon, for taking the time to speak to us today, and the leadership that you're showing on what is a huge issue for the country. But as usual, the final word will go to Dave Ward, our General Secretary, to round off the session. So Dave, I'll unmute you and bring you in. I'll also mention to everybody that the link to the Alliance for Full Employment is on the chat function. So please do check that out. Please do follow it on social media as well. And over to you for a final word, Dave.
To the point, thanks, Gordon. We'll continue to work on the campaign, and we really appreciate you coming on live and answering some of our members' questions. But my final message is that to make change happen, It's not a spectator sport. You have to get involved. You get involved with your trade unions, you get involved with the labour movement. What I've heard today is an opportunity for us to bring the labour movement back together again in the right way and prioritise this issue on jobs and the economy. So thanks very much, Gordon. Much appreciated.
It's been a pleasure, and it's great to be able to use technology that has been developed by your own members. I'm learning it for the first time, so it's great to be able to use it. Thank you.
Cheers.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone. And please do log on to the industrial sessions that are following on from this, and we will be in touch about the next steps of the New Deal for Workers campaign.
Thank you.
Well done, Andrew.